You're sitting on a plane. Your seat is slightly reclined, a glass of water rests in the armrest, and quiet music plays through your headphones. Outside the window, a pristine ocean of clouds stretches endlessly, and inside the cabin, silence reigns, broken only by the soft hum of the turbines. You don't even realize how miraculous this is, because flying is simple. It's normal. It's like a subway ride, only higher. You're not afraid. You're not surprised. You're just flying. And you don't notice that just a few generations ago, this very ordinariness seemed like madness, when air travel was deadly, cost a fortune, and demanded not only money but nerves of steel from passengers. Today you don't hear the roar of engines through sound-absorbing panels. You don't feel the cold through the sealed fuselage. You don't worry that an engine might fail at any moment. Yet, back in the 1930s, even the boldest airlines couldn't profit from passengers. And then, in the depths of the Great Depression, an airplane was born that changed everything. Just 90 years ago, flying wasn't normal. It was a deadly gamble. Only for the privileged. Only for the desperate. Airlines went bankrupt one after another. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, by 1934, 87% of commercial air carriers were on the verge of bankruptcy. Planes shook, broke down, and crashed. The aviation accident statistics of that era are frightening. One fatal incident for every 10,000 flight hours. Passengers, if they even dared to board, paid the equivalent of $20,000 in today's money for a few hours of torment in a cold, noisy, and dangerous fabric-covered wooden box. And yet, aviation still incurred losses, even with full cabins, even in perfect weather. All of this was collapsing, like all of America, under the weight of the Great Depression. And at this very moment, in the deepest part of the crisis, an airplane appeared that changed everything. Not in an era of growth, not in an era of abundance, but when it seemed that no one would be able to fly anymore. By the end of this story, you'll understand how one airplane, created without a single government subsidy, in the midst of economic collapse, against a backdrop of universal pessimism, managed not just to survive, but to teach an entire country to fly. You'll learn how engineers, businessmen, and pilots transformed a mortally risky journey into a profitable, safe, and even luxurious experience, and how this airplane became so important that its copies still ply the skies almost a century after its first flight. More than 10,000 examples of the DC-3 and its military version, the C-47, continued to serve into the 2020s, a record of longevity that, according to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, is unlikely to be broken. Imagine, you are a passenger. The year is 1928. You are seated not in a cabin, but in the open cockpit of a biplane. Yes, you are sitting outside. The wind whips your face like an icy whip. The temperature is 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The altitude is 2,000 meters. Your neighbor is a mailbag. In your ears, the roar of a Wright whirlwind engine. 220 horsepower rumbles at deafening decibels. Every 10 minutes, the pilot looks back and yells, "Everything all right?" You can't hear him. The wind carries away his words. The flight lasts 5 hours. You're freezing. You're deafened. You're praying. And you pay $150 for it, the equivalent of $2,500 today. This isn't a journey, it's a test of endurance. Why were airlines failing? Because passengers were a byproduct. The main revenue came from mail contracts. 80% of income was from the government. Without subsidies, bankruptcy. Planes flew at 150 kilometers per hour. They held 4, at most 6 people. Maintenance cost as much as maintaining a small army. Even fully loaded, a flight incurred a loss, a full cabin, and still a loss. This wasn't a management failure. It was a failure of the very idea to fly for passenger money. In 1934, everything collapsed. The airmail scandal. Congress canceled contracts. In 2 years, 32 out of 36 airlines disappeared. The industry was choking. And this is where it gets interesting. One man, C.R. Smith, president of American Airlines, asked a question that engineers averted their eyes from. What if an airplane could earn money on its own, without mail, without subsidies, only from passengers, only on trust, only on 21 seats? It sounded like heresy, but it was precisely heresy that saved the skies. Because Smith didn't just dream. He went to Douglas and issued a challenge, build a machine that would pay for itself, even if no one flew in it more than once a month, and let it fly faster than a train, and let it be warm and quiet and safe, and let a ticket cost not like a vacation, but like a pair of shoes. This wasn't an order. It was a manifesto. And in response, the DC-3 was born, not an airplane, but a new economy of flight. Summer of 1934, Santa Monica. Donald Douglas's office smelled of oil, coffee, and despair. Facing him was C.R. Smith, the president of American Airlines. His eyes blazed. His voice was taut as a violin string. He delivered an ultimatum: build an airplane that would make money from 21 passengers. No mail, no subsidies, just tickets. Douglas remained silent. Outside the window, the hum of machinery. In his mind, the wreckage of all previous attempts. The Boeing 247 held 10 people and still lost $12 per mile. And here, 21. In an era when people were saving on bread. Have you ever heard what the impossible sounds like? It was right there in that room. 21 people, in a metal fuselage, at altitude, without mailbags, without government checks, only trust, only demand, only the market. But Douglas didn't look away. He knew, if he said no now, aviation would remain a toy for the military and the wealthy. If he said yes, he'd have to turn engineering inside out. And he said yes, in just 48 hours. No meetings, no presentations, without regard for the fact that no one had ever done it that way. He simply called his best engineers and said, "Let's begin. We're not building an airplane. We're building a business model with wings." Imagine, you're an engineer. You're told to make every rivet profitable, to make the skin not just hold its shape, but reduce fuel consumption, to make the seats not just sit, but convince the passenger to pay. This isn't about aerodynamics. It's about economics in 3 dimensions. And here's the crucial point, a quote you won't find in textbooks, but which explains everything. Arthur E. Raymond, the chief engineer, would later say, "We weren't designing an airplane. We were designing profit." Every line on the blueprint was a revenue calculation. Every kilogram of weight was an expense item. Every inch of the cabin was a potential dollar. Do you know that feeling when a decision is made not in a boardroom, but in the silence between 2 heartbeats? That's it. In that office. On that day. At that hour. Not a machine was born. An idea was born. Flight could be mass market. Accessible. Profitable. And all, thanks to one requirement: 21 passengers. Now all that remained was to turn audacity into metal, and for that, Douglas needed not dreamers, but reality hackers. Those who knew to make the world fly, you first had to make it pay, and they started with the most important thing, the fuselage, which had to accommodate not just bodies but the future. Arthur Raymond stands in the workshop, hands covered in oil. On the table, a blueprint, not a tent, a shell. Like an egg. Have you ever held an egg in your palm? Fragile, but squeeze it, and it will hold. So it was with the DC-3 fuselage, not a wooden frame with fabric, but a single aluminum shell where every sheet bore the load. Colleagues shook their heads. Too heavy, too expensive. But Raymond knew to squeeze 21 people in and make them pay, you need volume. And he won. A diameter of 2 meters 70, 40% wider than the Boeing 247. Inside, not cramped, but spacious. Space is money. The engines. Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp. 2 engines. If one quit, the other would get you there. Previously, failure occurred once every 200 hours. Now, once every 2,000. Reliability was no longer a dream. It became a calculation. Flaps. Fowler flaps. Not just simple plates. They extended backward and downward, increasing the wing area. Takeoff from 600 meters. Land on a dirt strip in Montana, and no one would say you were in the middle of nowhere. Aerodynamics? Smooth as a drop of mercury. Landing gear retracted inward. Cowlings streamlined. No protruding bolts, no noise. Just a clean airflow. And here's a figure that made Boeing engineers turn pale. The DC-3 sped at 290 kilometers per hour. Twice as far. On the same fuel. New York. Los Angeles. Previously, 2 days, 10 stops, frost in the cockpit. Now, 1 day, 3 stops, warmth, silence. A ticket, like a pair of shoes. The plane cost $104,000, 30% cheaper than the Boeing, but it carried twice as many. You weren't just flying, you were flying profitably. Every flight, a plus in the ledger. Imagine, you are a passenger. You're not shaking. The engine isn't failing. No drafts in the cracks. You're sitting in a seat with armrests, drinking coffee, looking out the window, and you can't believe that just yesterday, flying was torture. But that's not enough, because fear doesn't disappear with numbers. It disappears with luxury. And so the DC-3 was clad not in aluminum, but in trust, velvet seats, wood paneling, stewardesses in uniforms by Elsa Schiaparelli. You weren't buying a ticket, you were buying status. And here it was, the final move. To teach a country to fly, you first had to make it dream. You step into the cabin, and you stop. No wind, no cold. Only the warm glow of brass sconces, casting soft shadows on polished walnut panels. Underfoot, carpet, not duralumin. In your ears, not a roar, but the gentle hum of the twin wasp, muffled by a layer of cork. A stewardess in a crisp uniform by Elsa Schiaparelli greets you, white gloves, a genuine smile. She offers a glass of champagne in a crystal flute. You sink into a dark burgundy velvet seat, not hard, not narrow, but substantial, with armrests and a headrest. On the table, a porcelain plate with a gold rim, hot soup, a linen napkin. Outside the window, night, but inside, an ocean liner, only in the clouds. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculation. Douglas and his team understood, to make people pay, you had to kill fear. And fear doesn't die from numbers. It dies from luxury. That's why every inch of the cabin was designed like a dining car with wings. Heating from exhaust gases. Sound insulation, cork sheets. Spaciousness, 2 meters 70 in diameter. You don't curl up. You stretch out, and you pay. Willingly. Again and again. By 1940, 90% of all commercial flights in the U.S. were flown on DC-3s. Mail? Forget it. Now the main cargo was people and their trust. But here's a paradox that makes today's business class pale in comparison. You were served dinner on porcelain. You slept on a fold-down berth behind a silk curtain. The stewardess knew your name, and a ticket cost $35 for 1,000 miles, half the price of a Boeing 247, and the same as a first-class train car. Luxury became mass market, and mass market became luxury. Imagine, you're flying across America, and it's not torture, but an event. You come home and brag not about having flown, but about what you were served. And then the world exploded. War, 1941. The peaceful airliner transformed into a machine of victory. Its military version, the C-47, became the eyes, legs, and lungs of the Army. 10,000 units. The D-Day airborne assault. Supply drops in Bastogne. Transporting troops over the hump, the Himalayas. That same fuselage that once carried velvet and porcelain now carried ammunition and hope. And all because one day in an office in Santa Monica, one man said, yes. Have you ever wondered why the DC-3 became the C-47? Because it was already perfect. It didn't need to be reinvented. The velvet seats were removed. The wooden panels were ripped out. Hatches were welded in. The floor was reinforced. And that was it. The rest, it already worked. 2 engines of 1,200 horsepower each. Even if one failed, the other kept going. The semi-monocoque fuselage, not fabric on a frame, but a single aluminum shell. A bullet would penetrate, but the plane wouldn't fall apart. And in the field, it was repaired with a wrench and tape. Pilots, thousands of them. All had already flown the civilian version. War didn't wait. It took what was there. And it turned out to be a weapon. Imagine, 10,174 aircraft, more than any other transport plane in history, more than all modern airliners during the same period. This isn't a number, it's an army. It's logistics as a weapon. The C-47 dropped 13,000 paratroopers on the night of June 6th. Without it, no D-Day. It flew over the hump, the Himalayas, filled with ice and anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition to China. It carried 2,300,000 tons of food to Berlin when the city was suffocating under blockade. It didn't shoot, but without it the war would have lasted longer. Years, maybe decades. General Eisenhower would later write, "The C-47, the eyes and legs of the Allies." Remember that. Not tanks, not bombers. This aircraft, quiet, simple, reliable, became a weapon of hope. Its armor, calculation. Its strength, versatility. Its victory, in that it didn't break down when lives depended on it. And then, silence. The war ended. 8,000 surplus C-47s were sold for $5,000, like scrap metal. But they didn't die. They returned to the sky, no longer with soldiers, with doctors, with coffee, with letters, with dreams. And again, they taught the world to fly. 1955, Seattle. Above the city, the jet trail of a Boeing 707. The future, speed, glamour. And at that very moment, 3,000 miles away, on a gravel strip in Nome, Alaska, a DC-3 takes off with a roar and a screech. In the cabin, a hunter with a Winchester, a teacher with an arithmetic textbook, and 2 tourists chasing the northern lights. No screens, no turbines. Only steel, aluminum, and confidence. Have you ever seen the future soaring overhead while the present takes off from a dirt runway? That's it. The present. Why wasn't it displaced? Because the DC-3 didn't sell dreams. It solved problems. It was bought for $5,000, like a truck, repaired with a hammer and rivets, landed on a strip shorter than a football field. Fuel consumption, 120 gallons per hour. Crew, 2 people. No flight engineer, no systems that break down from dampness. In Colombia, in Congo, in Fiji, where the road ends, it begins. As Aviation Week wrote, if you can afford one airplane, it will be a DC-3. Not a choice, a necessity. Here's the paradox that makes your heart stop. The DC-3 has flown longer than the Boeing 747, longer than the Airbus A380, 80 years, and it's still working. 300 aircraft, not in museums, not on pedestals, but in the sky, in the Canadian taiga, in the Indonesian jungles, in the Kalahari Desert. Some with tail numbers from 43. How? Because great decisions don't age. They wait, again and again. This is not a machine. This is a philosophy without excess, where every bolt is for trust, every rivet is for life. And to understand where it came from, you have to forget about the engines. You have to remember the people. The engineer who chose aluminum instead of wood. The businessman who set the condition, profit without subsidies. The pilot who said, "I'll put my family in it." It was they, not technology, who created what doesn't die. You're sitting in the seat. Outside the window, night. In the cabin, silence. And suddenly you realize you're not just being carried, you're being protected. Because in 1934, Eddie Rickenbacker, a war ace, a hero with 22 aerial victories, looked at the blueprints and told Douglas, "I'll put my family in it." Not passengers, not clients, family. This wasn't a demand. It was a vow. And it changed everything. Because before that, planes were built for mail, for records, for brave men. But here, for a father who fears for his child, for a husband who wants to return to his wife, for a person who is not ready to die for speed. Imagine, you're an engineer. You're told, "Make sure my daughter doesn't die if the engine stalls over the mountains." And you abandon fabric, wooden ribs, open cockpits. You choose aluminum, a monolithic fuselage, 2 engines, where each is a backup for the other. You install flaps that allow landing even on a dirt strip, not for efficiency, for life. Everyone around laughed. Old aircraft factories called the DC-3 madness. Too big, too expensive, too bold. Who will pay for 21 tickets in the middle of the Depression, they asked. But Douglas and Raymond didn't answer. They built. $300,000, the company's entire stake, one chance, one airplane. And here's the paradox. The greatest breakthroughs happen not in times of abundance, but when everything is falling apart. When bankruptcies are the norm, when trust is a luxury. That's when something is born that no one believes in. and that's when it wins. In 1936, the DC-3 made its first commercial flight, without mail, without subsidies, only passengers, and profit. For the first time in history, aviation ceased to be charity. It became a business, because someone dared to say, "I will trust my family to it." Look here, this isn't about technology. It's about fear, about fatherhood, about how one man turned a machine into a promise and made an entire country believe the sky is not a chasm. The sky is home. You're sitting in the cabin, not yesterday, not in a museum, right now. Outside the window, clouds. Beneath you, an aluminum floor that remembers the hands of Arthur Raymond, the voice of C.R. Smith, and the vow of Eddie Rickenbacker. And you suddenly realize this flight is not an exception. It never ended. Everything we see in the sky today was born here, in a trinity that no one planned but everyone felt. Engineers didn't just weld metal, they invested a calculation of life into every rivet. Businessmen didn't just sell tickets, they proved that trust could be monetized. And passengers didn't just sit in a seat. For the first time, they believed that the sky wouldn't kill them for their courage. Imagine 1936. You're a teacher from Chicago. For the first time in your life, you're flying to Dallas. You're not shaking. You're not freezing. The roar doesn't scare you. You're drinking coffee from a porcelain cup, and outside the window, the sunset, spreading across the clouds like oil on canvas. And you think, I'll be back tomorrow. Not in a week, not by steamboat, tomorrow. Because the DC-3 erases distances not with speed, but with certainty. But here's what textbooks hide. The DC-3 won not because it was smarter. It won because it was simpler. Simpler to repair. Simpler to pilot. Simpler to trust. It didn't need to be explained. You just had to turn it on. 2 engines. A clean fuselage. Seats where you could sleep. That's it. No artificial intelligence, no sensors, no clouds, only steel, calculation, and a promise. And therein lies the genius. Not the kind that screams from magazine covers, but the kind that works in the quiet of a gravel runway in Alaska, the kind that carries medicine to Congo, the kind that waits for you when the road ends. Because great decisions don't require updates. They require faith. Today we build everything more complex, smarter, faster. But ask yourself, what of this will still be flying in 80 years? What will withstand war, depression, oblivion, and still take off from a dirt runway to bring a child home? Now, it's your turn. What do you think? Is a breakthrough possible today that is built not on data, but on trust? Not on algorithms, but on simplicity? Can a modern engineer create a machine that will serve longer than his grandchildren? Write in the comments, for simplicity or for complexity. Because as long as someone chooses the former, the sky remains home.